Welcome to the 215th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with J. Aaron Sanders, author of the mystery novel, Speakers of the Dead. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is J. Aaron Sanders, author of the new novel, Speakers of the Dead. Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Great. Well, can you read the first 2 or 3 pages of Speakers of the Dead?
Yeah, I'd love to. This is from chapter 1. So I'm skipping the prologue and jumping right into chapter 1. They are going to kill her. Walt Whitman, reporter for the New York Aurora, is standing in the courtyard of the tombs with several hundred New Yorkers who have crushed past his cold, aching body for a glimpse of the execution. The sun is at the halfway point on its short cycle through the winter sky, and its low angle casts long shadows from west to east, shadows that cover all but the east wall of the prison. It is on this wall that Lena's large and lonely shadow is cast as if by stage light. The noose dances in the harsh winter wind, and below the gallows a layer of frost blankets the dirt. Walt pushes his way to the front of the crowd, the ice crystals crunching beneath his boots. They are all waiting for Sheriff Jack Harris to return from his meeting with Mayor Morris about whether or not to grant Mrs. Stowe a stay on her execution because of her pregnancy. Walt worries that the decision to deny the stay is a fait accompli, which is why he brought with him a sheaf of testimonials from Lena's medical students in which they argue that the fetus is quickened, a legal problem for the city because if the fetus has begun to move, New York would be executing 2 of its citizens instead of 1. The sheriff's coach, a new yellow phaeton, rumbles through the prison gates, around the crowd, and skids to a stop. Jack Harris's silver hair is stuffed under a top hat. His bearded face is deceptively slight compared to his stout body. By reputation, he is a man who sometimes puts instinct before protocol. Whitman calls out to the sheriff, and when he tries to follow the lawman, 2 guards block his way. He scurries back around to the front of the gallows for a better view. The arrest and trial were rushed affairs, rigged against her from the beginning, it seemed, and her defense never gained any real traction with anyone but those closest to her. The students know Lena and Abraham. They spent time with them every day for months, and they saw what Walt saw. A couple who, despite their problems, had become closer. None of them even considered Lena as a suspect until Sheriff Harris arrested her. At the sheriff's appearance atop the gallows, the crowd quiets. The silence presses down on Walt, and he fights back feelings of despair. The woman who treated him like a son is beautiful and haggard, still wearing the medical school-issued black dress and white apron, stained with her husband's blood, having refused to change since her arrest. Her long black hair ribbons stream in the wind, and her dark eyes are red and swollen. His heart aches to see her suffer like this. The sheriff approaches the condemned woman, her body quivering, and he whispers in her ear. There is a moment of nothingness, and then she reels backward, emitting a preternatural scream that convulses Walt's soul. Lena flails until the wiry priest powerfully grips her shoulder. And God hath raised up the Lord, he calls out in his baritone voice, and will also raise you up by his own power. But the baby! Whitman rushes the stairway, but is again blocked by the 2 guards. He shuffles backward, stands on his tiptoes. Behind him the bloodthirsty crowd stirs. Harris pauses for a moment, then nods to the jailer, little Joe, who holds Lena fast while the sheriff ties her hands behind her back. Walt's heart races. This time Whitman charges, using his large frame to knock one guard to the side, the other to the ground, before ascending the staircase 2 steps at a time. On the hanging platform, 6 coppers line the back end. There's the priest, wide-eyed and hunched over. There's little Joe, twice as big as any other man in the city. And there's Sheriff Harris. Walt holds up the leather-bound sheaf. These medical testimonies demonstrate that Mrs. Stowe is quick with child. The sheriff shakes his head. Mr. Whitman, our medical experts reached a different conclusion. A few feet away, Lena's sobs are muted by the wind. Walt takes a step forward toward the sheriff, and 2 policemen meet him. Mrs. Stowe's colleagues disagree. These women are not doctors. The sheriff turns away, but Whitman catches him on the shoulder. You're a good man. I saw how you restored order after the cigar girl was murdered. The law is the law. Whitman pushes a little harder. This city does not need another controversy. At the delay, the crowd jitters, the kind of tottering that precedes a mob action. The sheriff briefly looks Walt in the eye, then gestures to two of his men, and they promptly take Walt into custody. Her death will be on your watch, Whitman shouts. Knowing that Walt has failed, Lena resumes her struggle to get free. She rolls toward the edge of the platform and nearly goes over. But little Joe grabs her from behind and lifts her to her feet. During the commotion, Walt wrestles away, but a third man kicks him in the stomach and the other two retake him. The pain is searing. He rolls to the side. The watchmen have the platform covered, and there are more of them on the ground for crowd control, and even more at the gate. He is surrounded. The sheriff slips the black hood over Lena's head and reaches for the noose, and that's when the men holding Whitman loosen their grip just enough. He wiggles free, dodges Harris, and scoops up Lena, black hood and all. She is heavy in his arms, but the adrenaline drives him to brave the blockade of 6 men, their Colt pistols drawn, their faces blank. He charges through them and miraculously sees daylight between him and the stairway. If only he can make it down. And then the space closes and the men are upon him. Walt clings to Lena with all his might until she whispers, her voice strong and deliberate from beneath the hood. It's over, Walt. You did your best. He holds back his tears. But you're innocent. Keep the college going so our deaths are not in vain. He holds her tighter. It takes 4 men to hold Whitman and 2 more to pry Lena away from him. The men push him to the ground and cuff him, the metal cutting into his wrists. Walt screams, curses, thrashes about, mad with rage over what is about to happen. He watches as the sheriff slips the noose over Lena's head, positions her over the trap door, and addresses those who condemned her to this fate. For the murder of Abraham Stowe, he bellows, you have been sentenced to death by hanging, after which your body will be dissected at the Women's Medical College of Manhattan. The crowd roars. Walt breathes in. The sheriff claps 3 times. The lever is pulled and the door falls away. Lena's body drops. Her neck breaks. And Walt Whitman collapses on the platform, sobbing now, and waits for his friend and her unborn child to die.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about Speakers of the Dead yet, how would you describe your novel?
Well, it features a young Walt Whitman in 1843, before he becomes the Walt Whitman who wrote Leaves of Grass, and it follows him around New York City as he's struggling to write the follow-up to his temperance novel, Franklin Evans. And he befriends a group of young women doctors, and when one of them is wrongly accused of her husband's death and then executed, he sets out to solve that mystery.
And do you remember the original idea or impetus that led you to writing Speakers of the Dead, and specifically a novel featuring Walt Whitman and a mystery setting?
Yes, I've been obsessed with Whitman for years, and when I was teaching Leaves of Grass to students, I really didn't know what to do with him, and so I was reading these biographies about him, and I came across this amazing story about when he was 12 and he moved away from home to be a printer's devil for this man named Samuel Clement. And while he was working for Clement, Clement was busted for grave robbery, and it turns out that Clement and this other guy had dug up the body of the recently deceased Quaker prophet Elias Hicks, and they were going to make statuettes of Hicks's head and sell them for hundreds of dollars. And it also turns out that Walt grew up admiring Hicks. So it was this interesting conflict for young Walt, who was away from home for the first time, probably looked up to Clement as a father figure, also looked up to Hicks. And then there was this weird moment where Clement digs up Hicks's body. And it introduced the idea of body snatching to me, which I found fascinating. And I wanted to write about that story first, but then I thought it would be more interesting to fast forward a little bit to the early 1840s, when we don't know that much about Walt Whitman's life, and kind of set it there, and also sort of explore what might have happened to lead that Walt Whitman to write Leaves of Grass. So that was it.
Right. How much research did you do about Whitman's life before you sat down to start writing the novel?
Well, I researched this like I was researching my dissertation. So a lot. I sort of did what I was trained to do as a graduate student and just checked out every book I could find, looked up recent scholarly works on Whitman, and dug in that way. So, and I found it very useful because just like a dissertation, I think a historical novel has to be researched at almost sentence by sentence. And so that was really useful.
That's great. Well, I know that you're a professor of English at Columbus State University in Georgia. When did you first decide to pursue writing and teaching English and literature?
Well, there were two key moments for me. The first had nothing to do with English, but I remember going to my first college class, which was accounting, and the professor had just returned from Hawaii on a sabbatical, and I thought, I want to do that. And and then later, when I stumbled into my first English course, I still remember the professor, Marissa Januzzi, and I just really felt comfortable in that classroom. And so then I knew then I wanted to be an English professor. And all along, I had been writing stories, and that first sort of clicked for me when I was in high school, and I had this great teacher named Douglas Bonzo, and we called him DGB, and he would bring cupcakes on Emily Dickinson's birthday every year, and he made a real impression on me. And he liked my writing, and he would have me read my my personal essays in front of the class, and he would just sit up there and laugh. And he was sort of my first audience, and I really liked making him laugh. And so that's when the writing began.
Sure. Had you attempted to write a novel prior to writing Speakers of the Dead, or had you only written short stories?
No, I had tried to write novels from the beginning, and I must have about 5 failed novels. And from each one, I learned a lot. I think I started writing novels before I was ready. And so I would write stories in between and sort of fine tune my technique. And I kept reading and working. And so each attempt at the novel, I think, got better, but there were big problems with those early novels, and even Speakers of the Dead took a long time for me to write. I wrote several drafts and had to stop a few times to write a dissertation, for example, and I pitched a TV show in between, and I just kind of kept at it. And I think when my technique caught up with my idea, I was able to finally write it. But novel writing, there are so many ways to mess it up, and so many mistakes you might make. And I know some people seem to get it right the first time, but it just wasn't the case for me. I just had to keep at it.
Sure.
And, yep.
Have you thought about going back and trying to rework any of those earlier novels, or are you just looking ahead at this point?
I'm mostly looking ahead, but there is one. I wrote this novel about the disappearance of Ambrose Bierce, and it was kind of a parallel narrative. A character in the present who was trying to figure out what happened to Bierce because he famously disappeared in Mexico in the early 1900s, and then it follows Bierce as he. It follows Bierce in Mexico as he's about to disappear. So I think that one might work, but I have a lot of work to do on it.
Sure. So at this point, are you planning to write more Walt Whitman mysteries?
Yes, I have book 2 about 70% done. This one follows Walt and his brother Jeff down to New Orleans. And so I've done a lot of research in New Orleans, which has been really fun. And this is where Whitman comes into first sees slavery with his own eyes. And scholars believe that this was a pivotal moment for him in the development of Leaves of Grass. And so I've tried to imagine a story that brings him into really close contact with slavery, and that he sees how it works up close. And also the mystery is centered around that. And then in book 3, he's going to go back to New York City and team up with Edgar Allan Poe one more time.
Oh, great. What advice would you have for aspiring writers who might be listening and trying to write their own stories or novels?
I think the best advice I can give someone is to develop a ritual around writing. And I heard often that I needed to write every day, and for me that works. I love getting up in the morning, brewing coffee, and getting to work. I just get very excited to do that. But I know that that doesn't work for everyone. But I think developing a ritual that brings you to the computer, if not every day, then almost every day, and just sort of showing up. Because I've learned that a lot of my writing problems get worked out in between those sessions. So perhaps I only write for an hour one morning, and I have a big problem. When I show up the next day, it often works itself out in my head, and I'm not even aware of it. And it's the regularity that seems to help me the most. But I think developing that ritual, which includes writing and reading the books that you want to be like, is some of the best advice I could give. It's not original, but it remains the best advice.
Sure. Well, are there books or authors that you've read in the last year or two that impressed you and that you would recommend? Either newer books or older ones as well.
Yeah, I love Patricia Highsmith's Ripley books. I read those over and over and over, and I feel not that I'm on her level, but I feel like my writing style is similar to hers, and at least that's how it seems to me. So reading her over and over is very useful for me, and I just love the books. I also like Henning Mankell, who recently died, and the Wallander books are really great too. And in terms of historical mysteries, I still love Matthew Pearl's book, The Dante Club, a lot, and I read that over and over. And of course, the book that kind of gave me the courage to move forward in the first place with this idea was The Alienist, which remains a classic.
Sure. Well, again, we've been speaking with J. Aaron Sanders, author of the novel Speakers of the Dead. The book is in bookstores now, so go grab a copy. And Aaron, thanks for doing this interview.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
Great.
Snow falls on an old apartment. Inside, the holiday season is in swing. On the first floor, Cokes are poured and stories shared among friends. 3 flights up, one generation passes down the family recipe to the next.
So good.
Inside every home, there's magic. Coca-Cola. Real magic.
Enjoy the real magic of the season with close friends, family, and refreshing Coca-Cola paired with all your holiday meals.